Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Sunday Life. I know some of you are concerned with the things that are going on in the Middle East. I'm getting a lot of questions about what these things mean regarding the second coming of Christ and the end times. I don't want you to be misinformed and about the things that are happening and why they're happening. Many are now and have in the past used times like these to excite and cause people to become stressed about the threat of the end of the world. And many have made lots of money by offering their views on the scriptures regarding the end times. We know we've all seen it. I don't want you to be deceived or misled by these profiteers. I don't call them prophets, they're profiteers. In this episode and several future episodes that we're going to go through, I'll present from Matthew 24 and 25 what Jesus told his disciples to expect before his second coming. We're going to discuss what's commonly called eschatological theology. Big word. It just means the study of last things or the study of the end times. What is the destiny of humanity? What's the destiny of our world as far as God is concerned and what he's told us in scriptures? This episode I've entitled The Beginning of Things to Come. In our last episode, which I've linked in the notes below, we looked at Matthew 23, where Jesus brought an indictment against Israel in the declaration of 7 woes. Now, from the charges that Jesus brought, he demonstrated that Israel was guilty of breaking the Mosaic covenant, and they were guilty of the blood of the prophets that their ancestors had killed. He said that the generation that he was speaking to in the first century was going to be accountable for the sins of the nation. And the sentence was that Israel would become desolated. Delivering this judgment on Israel in the first century, Jesus left the temple. Now let's read from Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. It says, "As Jesus left and was going out of the temple, his disciples came up and called his attention to the buildings. He replied to them, 'Do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down.'" Now, Jesus has about 3 days before his trial, his crucifixion, and his death. And his closest followers still don't get what he's doing, what's going to be happening. It was difficult for the disciples to grasp Israel's future. Growing up, they had heard all the kingdom teachings. Every Jew knew that the Messiah was going to restore Israel and he was going to defeat their enemies. But what if they're wrong? What if all the teachings about Israel and the Messiah and the kingdom were wrong? Could their bias towards Judaism, their nationalism, and their entitlement as God's people allow them to see the truth that Jesus was telling them? Jesus said that the nation would become desolate, but the temple's supposed to be the centerpiece of the Messiah's kingdom. The disciples were still in the dark about the kingdom of heaven, but many are in the dark today, even about the kingdom that Jesus preached. So Jesus makes it plain to his disciples by saying, not one stone of the temple will be left upon another. It will all be torn down. That's as clear as he could be. Nothing will be left of the temple. After a little time for the disciples to kind of consider what Jesus had told them, they got together and they sent Peter and James and John to probe a little deeper into what Jesus had said. In Matthew 24, verse 3, we read, "While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives," which is just outside of Jerusalem, the disciples approached him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age. From the context of Luke, there's two key points of interest for the disciples. When are these things going to happen? They wanted to know when the destruction of the temple will happen. Right here, the when only has to do with the destruction of the temple. They're not talking about the destruction of the end of the world. They're talking about when will these things happen, what they were just discussing, the destruction of the temple. Nothing else. The second point of interest is, what are the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, prophets give signs. Jesus was a prophet. So, what signs can Jesus give them about his coming and the end of the age? Now, we have to ask ourselves, what age? There are many different ages that are discussed here, and we get confused by thinking, well, they're automatically talking about the end of the world, of the end of the age. There's another age that Jesus is talking about here when he's discussing the destruction of the temple. Now, the disciples know that Jesus is going to leave them and he's going to return, but they didn't fully comprehend the details. When would he come back? In Matthew 16:21, we read, "From then on, Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, the chief priests, and scribes, and be killed and be raised on the third day." In Matthew 20:18 through 19, Jesus says, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. They will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked, flogged, and crucified, and on the third day he will be raised." And then in John 14:3, Jesus says, "If I go away and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, you may be also." They might not have fully understood the timeline or the specifics, but they knew something significant was going to happen. The disciples have some questions. These questions need to be answered. When will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of its impending destruction? What will be the sign of the coming of Jesus? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? Now, Jesus is going to answer all these questions, but his response isn't simple, and it won't be what they expect to hear. What Jesus is going to tell them goes against everything they've been taught about the kingdom of God and Israel, and everything that they thought that the prophets had wrote about Israel in the Torah. Let's read how Jesus responds to their questions from Matthew 24, verses 4 through 7. Jesus replied to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these events are the beginnings of labor pains." Now you've got questions about this, right? What Jesus told them didn't answer their questions. Yes, he didn't answer those questions yet. He will give them the answers that they're looking for, but he has to first prepare them for the answers with some warnings. In the Greek, verse 4 of Matthew, it should be translated, "Proceed with caution, lest someone lead you astray." Now, who would lead them astray? Jesus explains who would lead them astray in verse 5. The Greek in verse 5 is translated, "Many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and deceive many." Now, the interpretation of these two verses suggests that there will be individuals or teachers who falsely claim to represent Christ and deceive others. The syntax of the Greek in these verses shows that some will come claiming to be the Messiah, but also some will come as teachers and leaders within the Christian community, coming in his name, saying, I am the Messiah, meaning Jesus is the Messiah. They're coming as Christians, Christian teachers, and Christian leaders coming in the name of Christ. And they will lead people astray with false teachings and false claims. The emphasis of the false teachings in these verses is to be deceitful influence about the end times. They're coming and they're telling people deceitful information about the end times. And before the disciples can hear the answers to their questions, they need to understand the importance of discerning the truth. They also need to know how important it is to remain faithful to what he's about to tell them. Now, following his warnings to the disciples, Jesus tells the disciples not to be anxious about the end times. He tells them there will be wars and rumors of wars, signifying the presence of conflict that will be close to them. He tells them that nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, which points to widespread conflicts in the world. And he tells them that there will be famines and earthquakes, which highlight natural disasters. Now, Jesus is saying there will be military conflicts, there'll be societal unrest, and there'll be natural calamities happening, but don't let these things trouble you. These kinds of things are just the initial events of more challenging things to come. Now, we'll see these played out in future episodes as we go through and we discuss this more and Jesus' answers and how he gives them the when and the signs. Like the disciples, we all have questions about the end times. We want to know when the end will come and what signs there will be as to the warning before the end comes. We can learn from what Jesus told the disciples to stay vigilant and don't let anyone deceive you about the end times. Jesus said, many will come and many will be deceived. Now, the significance of Matthew using that word many twice in the same sentence emphasizes the widespread nature of the deception about the end times. I mean, what else are we more, people come and try to deceive others about besides the end times? There will be a substantial number of people claiming to be the Messiah and those representing Christ, and they'll deceive a lot of people. Jesus was also telling the disciples to be prepared for the turbulent and the distressing times leading to the fulfillment of God's plans, but don't be anxious over it. How many of us get anxious when we see these things that are going on? Jesus is saying, don't be anxious about these things. Jesus concludes his preparation of his disciples to receive his answers to their questions about when the temple will be destroyed and the signs of his coming and the end of the age with Matthew 24:8. He says, all these events are the beginnings of labor pains. The false messiahs, the false teachers, the military conflicts, the social upheavals, and the natural disasters are all the signs like labor pains. That day is approaching when the expectancy of the temple's destruction and the coming of Jesus and the end of the age will be delivered. But as they observe these things, they shouldn't be anxious or confused. They should keep looking toward the future. And as they're looking forward, they should always remember this is just the beginning. The unfolding of God's plan for our salvation began 2,000 years ago. It began as a sequence of events with what happened with Christ going to the cross. It will continue to unfold until we see the second coming of Christ. There's no escape pod for the disciples or for us. People who talk about the rapture, escaping these things that are going to be coming on, there's no escape. There wasn't any escape for the disciples. Everything will be escalating until the end. And if it's escalating, then we need to be prepared for the new beginning. Like labor pains, they'll become more and more severe and intense as time passes. But the delivery of God's kingdom will take away all the pain. The disciples and all believers will spend our time on earth preparing for the new heaven and the new earth. And then there will be Christ, and we will be with him forever. And we should endure by faith, encourage each other, even in turbulent times, to endure and have faith in God's plan for our salvation. The disciples were commissioned by Jesus to preach the gospel and make disciples, teaching them to obey all that he commanded them. That's the commission of the church, to make disciples of Christ and to encourage the faith and the knowledge of him in all who believe. Things are going to get harder for the church. So as those trials increase, we must support and encourage each other by faith as we anticipate his glorious second coming. In the next episode, we're going to continue in Matthew 24 and answer the disciples' questions that they asked here. The first question is, when will the temple be destroyed, and what will be the sign before its destruction? If there's anything in this message that you want to comment about or ask me about, you want more information, just leave your comment or your question in the comments section or on Facebook, or send me an email at jim@sundaylife.com. I respond to every comment, every question, and every email I receive. So until our next episode, may the Lord keep your heart and mind stayed upon his coming. And don't be concerned, don't be anxious about what you see going on in the world. God has a plan. So God bless you and keep you in his grace and in his love always. Thank you.